I love this photograph of President Theodore Roosevelt. Someone once said, the president looks like he's choking on his teeth. Yeah, you can see he had quite an exciting smile there, didn't he? Just loved life. The guy enjoyed every minute of it. He once said, I had a rattling good time being president. I can't imagine having a good time being president, but he did. His favorite adjective was bully. Everything was bully this and bully that. He just full of life and full of excitement, full of enthusiasm for his job and for the United States. And of course, by the time Roosevelt became president in September 1901, there were some pretty exciting things going on. I mean, we had America having risen to great power. There was all these exciting aspects of American life we just talked about. The growth of the American economy. Just an incredibly exciting time. But it wasn't long after Roosevelt became president, in fact, before he became president, that he, like many other Americans, began to become aware that while we had lots about which to celebrate, America had a lot of things to worry about. And even though we didn't yet know the kinds of international responsibilities that would come upon us during the 20th century, we'd become to be quite aware that along with the great blessings of the Industrial Revolution had also come some very serious problems. And we talked about this a bit in Unit 6. But in the first years of the 20th century, there were some very talented writers and other public-spirited people around who began to point out that while we should be very happy with the abundance and with the great progress of American civilization, let's not be so fast. There were also some serious problems. Now, when Roosevelt first took office, he noticed these writers who were out there publishing magazine articles and novels and other literature, suggesting that there were problems in American life needing to be corrected. And at first Roosevelt looked upon these people with some disdain, called them muckrakers. His title for these writers stuck, and they sort of wore it as a badge of courage later. But initially he thought of them negatively. He thought they were people who were refusing to see the good side of things and instead raking through the muck, looking for bad things. Well, the more Roosevelt became familiar, and as other Americans became familiar with the writings of these people, the more he and others became convinced that they were pointing out some very serious problems the American people needed to face and to confront. Let me give you maybe the best example of these muckrakers. This is a fellow called Upton Sinclair, originally from California. Sinclair had become convinced that the industrial system and everything surrounding it had become very abusive to the working class, that the people working in the factories and on the farms were suffering abuse because the people who owned the means of production really didn't care very much about them. And so Sinclair had become a socialist, somebody who believed that the government and other aspects of society should take control of the means of production and of society to make sure everybody benefited as much as possible equally. Well, Sinclair had published this book called The Jungle. This is a theater card for a movie made out of his book, not a very good one, but the book was a blockbuster. Everybody was reading it. Big, thick thing. Maybe you had to read it in high school. I don't know. The Jungle was about the meatpacking plants in Chicago. Chicago had become kind of the meat packer to the world, if you will. Here you see the vast stockyards outside of the city of Chicago, and in the background, the meat processing plants where literally millions of pigs and cows and sheep and other animals, to be honest, would be herded through these vast stockyards into these processing plants to be turned into sausage and canned beef and whatever other products to be shipped out to the public. Sinclair had gone to Chicago and he'd investigated what was going on in these meatpacking plants, and he had become just absolutely appalled at the horrible working conditions that the people there were suffering. And so he wrote this novel, very entertaining novel about some immigrant workers in the meatpacking industry and the kinds of lives they were leading and the kinds of abuses they were suffering. Well, everybody began to read this book, and as they read the book, they began to learn some pretty unsettling things. For example, the meat packers didn't really pay any attention to what they dumped into the river. There was a branch of the Chicago River called Bubbly Creek. Got its name because it was constantly bubbling and swirling about because of all the chemicals and other crap dumped into it by the meat packers. In fact, every now and then, Bubbly Creek would catch on fire, and the fire department would have to come and put the creek out. Now look, if you've got a creek that burns, you've got a serious pollution problem. And so as people read The Jungle, they began to say, oh my goodness, look at what we're doing to the world. Look at the abuse of the environment that's taking place. I mean, this is a long time before a whole lot of people became concerned about this, but it was disgusting. And Sinclair didn't pull any punches when he described the pollution taking place. He also showed that because the meat packers were motivated by the profit motive, they didn't care particularly how much money they had to dump into the politicians' pockets in order to get what they wanted. It was cheaper for the meat packers to pay off the government in Chicago, the city, so they could steal the water, so they could taint the investigations that might take place, pay off the henchmen who were supposed to be inspecting meat, stuff like that, so that the abuses of the industrial system were also creating widespread corruption and graft, just a kind of a byproduct, a natural byproduct. Now, as I mentioned, Sinclair's particular concern was the abuse of the workers. And the book was just full of stories of workers suffering unbelievably bad conditions at work. Some that would cripple them because they couldn't stand up. They'd spend all day stooped over. And pretty soon they'd be walking, as he described, like chimpanzees. And then some workers, because of where they worked, would fall into these big vats. And because it cost too much money to stop the machinery to fish them out, nothing would be fished out, and pretty soon these workers would literally be sent out as part of the product of the plant. So worker abuse so severe that sometimes it resulted in the death of the workers. And Sinclair, of course, wanted the public to understand clearly how much of this worker abuse was taking place. But in addition to the abuse of the workers, the profit motive was also stimulating consumer fraud. And by that I mean that he displayed case after case in which the meat packers were putting into cans, cow guts, for example, flavoring it up with something, and then sending it out to the public as canned chicken, or canning horses and sending it out as canned beef. And so consumer fraud, we're selling stuff that isn't really what we tell the public it is. It's something different we tell the public it is. And sometimes, because we're cutting corners and because it's easier not to lift out a poisoned rat that we've dumped into the sausage, our products are downright dangerous and result in the deaths of our customers. We're literally producing products that kill people. And because if we own these means of production, we're making plenty of money, we don't worry too much about that. Well, Roosevelt read The Jungle. He called together a bunch of his pals and he put together a special presidential commission. He sent them off to Chicago to check it out, to see if Sinclair was pulling our legs. These guys came back and presented their report to the president and said, look, if anything, he pulled his punches. He painted a fairly accurate picture of what goes on out there in Chicago in the meatpacking industry. And before we go any further with this discussion, let me make sure you understand something. Sometimes I'll have students who listen to this discussion and they think, well, there was something wrong with the food processing industry. Well, if there was something wrong with the food processing industry, can't you assume that there must have been something wrong with all kinds of industries? In other words, we're just using this as an example, and it was an example that the American people during the first part of the 20th century got a hold of because, look, everybody has to eat. And by the turn of the 20th century, more than half of us are living in cities, so we We can't go down the road to the neighbor to get sausage. We're going to have to buy it at the market, and it's going to be produced in Chicago or someplace and shipped in from maybe thousands of miles away. So we've developed this national economy, indeed an international economy, in which we rely on these big, impersonal, massive means of production to produce the things we need to survive. So when people put The Jungle down after having read it, they said, oh my goodness, I feel bad for the workers, but I feel bad for me too. Ooh, that's why little Frank swole up and died last year. So the American people began to become very, very concerned about these abuses. And as they became very concerned, from Theodore Roosevelt on down, and particularly in the mind of a guy like Roosevelt, who was a very activist president, he saw himself as a leader, somebody who needed to take a hold of problems and figure out ways to solve them. People began to say, look, we've got to get after this. We can't let this go on. There developed a crusading spirit, a sense of urgency, a sense among people from top to bottom in society, across classes, both political parties, that something needed to be done. Look, the old idea in a free enterprise system was something we call laissez-faire. This is a French phrase that means essentially leave it alone. And the idea was that if you have a free enterprise production system, the government and everybody should just back off and let natural forces drive the economy. Competition will keep prices low, quality high. Well, it had worked very nicely, thank you, to create all kinds of wealth. And as we mentioned a few minutes ago, the Americans are enjoying more wealth and goods than perhaps anybody in history on such a wide scale. It had worked very nicely. But it had an ugly side to it. And the ugly side was that because of the success of the Industrial Revolution, the guys who owned the means of production can heap these abuses on the public and get away with it and make lots and lots of money doing it. And so people began to say, well, we can't just leave this alone anymore. We've got to take action. We've got to do something. Now, there were some people around, like Sinclair himself, who said, look, we've got the answer. I'll give you an example. The fellow on the left here is a fellow by the name of Eugene Debs. He was the great American socialist at the time. In Europe, socialism was taking hold, and the idea here was that the government and society in general should take a very firm hand in taking hold of the whole system, like the economy, society, and everything else, and work aggressively to make it more just and to make it more fair and to bring the benefits of the production of the system to the workers as well as to those who own the system and as well as to the middle class. And so the socialists were running around, guys like Eugene Debs here, saying, turn the government over to us, and we'll fix the problem. We'll nip it in the bud. We will take over the means of production, if necessary, from the guys who run it, and we will produce goods and wealth for the consumption of the people without the profit motive, and therefore do away with all these abuses. We'll nip the problem in the bud. Well, Debs ran for president every 4 years for years. He'd get 8, 6, 9, one time 10% of the public voted for Eugene Debs and the socialists. But most Americans weren't impressed or persuaded by the socialist argument. And if you think about it, it makes sense. American civilization founded on the idea that a person has a right to private property. I mean, look, most of us have come over here to have our 40 acres, right, to be farmers. And then when the Industrial Revolution came along, the thinking was, look, if I build a factory and I'm producing something like meat products or like a spinning wheel or whatever I make, I should have the right to benefit from the effects of that production. I should be able to use my private property in order to get more private property. So Americans never had much warm fuzzies toward the idea of the government taking over control of the means of production. It just never caught on. But even as it didn't catch on, people were still saying, well, we've got to do something. And so the Americans came up with something that's kind of a unique solution to the problem. We call it progressivism. Now, this is a term you probably hear these days. In fact, quite often you'll hear someone say, well, I'm a progressive. A progressive is someone who believes that the government should take very progressive, very active role in dealing with society's problems. The government should do more. Liberals like to call themselves progressives. It's kind of become a bit of a synonym. Liberal meaning a liberal interpretation of the Constitution, the government should do more. And then there are those who say, well, I think the government's doing too much already and let's back off, and those folks would be the conservatives. So the debate has gone on ever since, but during the first part of the 20th century, just about everybody jumped on the progressive bandwagon. The thinking, again, being, we've got a big problem, a big set of problems here. The abuses of the industrial system that have grown up willy-nilly, unbridled profit, driving all this. We've got to take a firm hand and see if we can't figure out some way to bring them under control, short of turning the means of production over to the government. And so we came up with the idea that we will leave the means of production, the farms and the factories, in the hands of private owners, but we will pass a bunch of rules, regulations, a bunch of laws. The government, representing society and society's best interests, will regulate these private owners so that they can't do the abusive things that they've been doing. We're going to create agencies like the Food and Drug Administration to manage, to control, to watch those who produce food, drugs, cosmetics, things that people consume in their bodies, in order to prevent these folks from abusing the public. I think you're familiar with the Food and Drug Administration. Yeah, you're going to have to create government agencies to do this. And so the progressive ideal was that the government would take strong action and intervene in the private sector where necessary to try to clean up these abuses. So the bottom line is, if you're a progressive, you believe in strong government action. And of course, there could be all kinds of degrees of how much of this you think is a good idea. Now, if you're a conservative, you're probably saying, well, wait a minute, there's already enough government. I mean, we got too much government anyway. We need to back off. Well, it could be. That's a decision everybody has to make when he or she decides what kind of political party to belong to, for example. But during the progressive era, as we now call it, once again, just about everybody jumped on board this notion that at least we need to do something, if not a lot. From the top to the bottom, both political parties, Roosevelt the Republican, Woodrow Wilson, we'll talk about in the last part of this unit, the Democrat, leaders of both parties. It went across classes from top to bottom because just about everybody could see, look, everybody's being hurt, so we've got to do something. And so there became this sort of notion that general acceptance of strong government action to try to solve these problems was probably a good idea. Now, if you're a conservative, take heart in this. Historians agree that the most exciting things that happened during the progressive era happened not at the federal level, where there was lots of publicity and lots of attention, but at the state and local levels, where progressive governors and mayors and town councils and state legislatures got heavily involved in trying to come up with ways to solve these problems that the muckrakers had begun to point out to us, to clean up the abuses that had grown up during the Industrial Revolution with the willy-nilly rise, unbridled profit motive of the industrial system. Now, it makes sense that as this movement got underway, the progressives began to think not only in terms of just cleaning up the means of production and the problems of the economic system, but it became a general reform movement. In other words, the progressives began to think about all kinds of problems that America had. Let me give you an example of that. Because of the progressive movement and because of the general acceptance of the public of the progressive ideal, finally, in 1920, as part of the progressive movement, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed, granting women the right to vote and hold office. Now, to you and me, that may seem like an obvious thing. But because of the progressive ideal, because of this notion that it's time to clean up our problems, it's time to fix things, and this general crusading spirit, something like women's suffrage managed to get success after years of struggle. Now, as we conclude this discussion of the progressive movement, I guess I need to tell you that it wasn't all-inclusive. By that I mean, the progressives were anxious to clean up problems, and they cleaned up a lot of them. And they tried hard to clean up others. They didn't do a great job of doing it. But they also had a blind eye to certain things. For example, both Roosevelt and later Wilson, the Republican, the Democrat, had something of a blind eye when it came to how we treat folks who aren't white, particularly the African Americans among us, the former slaves, their sons, their granddaughters. Progressives didn't pay a lot of attention to racism and the problems attendant thereto. So I'm not going to tell you that the progressive movement was comprehensive in its attempt to fix America's problems, but it was really an exciting time. And no matter how you feel politically about the notion of progressivism today, this was certainly a time when the ideal of government action stepped up in a very powerful way to change the future course of American civilization.